Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Phoebe. So in today's video I'm going to share with you guys how I made this princess dart bustier with a square yoke. So I made this for someone who has a bust measurement of 50 inches. So previously I had made something similar for her using this black velvet fabric. She loved the outcome and wanted me to recreate something similar. So I did that using this onion colored velvet fabric, and I'm going to show you guys how I was able to do it. So before we get started, if you're new to this channel, please make sure you hit the subscribe button. And without further ado, let's jump right into the video. So as always, I'm going to start with the pattern drafting process, and I've gone ahead to mark out all the significant lines on the pattern paper. So her shoulder measurement is 18, half of that is 9 inches, so I mark that right there. Then her shoulder to her bust line is 10.5 inches, while her shoulder to her bust point line was 12 inches. Then her under bust line is 15 inches. Then her waistline or half length for the front is 18 inches plus half an inch as seam allowance. Then I came downwards by 1 inch for the shoulder slant, and then her armhole measurement was 19, half of that was 9.5, and I marked it right there. So after marking that, I marked a neck width of 3.5 inches because, like I said, she's a plus size. So 3.5 inches for the neck width. Then for the neck depth, I also went ahead to mark 3.5 inches. So the neckline I used was 3.5 by 3.5, and I went ahead to connect the 2 points together to create the neckline curve. Now on her waistline, I would mark half of her bust span measurement. 9 divided by 2 is 1/2. So I marked that right there on the waistline, and also mark the same thing at the under bust line, and mark the same thing at the bust point line, and I went ahead to connect the points together in a straight line. The next thing I did was to find the midpoint of her armhole line, and after marking that, I went inwards by a 0.75 inch. Then the next thing I did was to mark a dart of 2.5 inches on her waistline. So 2.5 divided by 2 would be 1.25 inches on both sides of the line. So remember, she's a plus size, so 2.5 inches on the waistline. Then on the under bust line, I would increase the dart intake to 3 inches. So 3 divided by 2 would be 1.5 inch on both sides of the line. Then I went ahead to just connect the 2 points together in a straight line. So the next stage is to mark 0.75 inch below her bust point line, and then using the curved part of my ruler, I connected from my underbust to that 0.75 inch below the bust point line. Now the next thing I did after that was to measure a quarter of her bust circumference on the bust line. So 50 divided by 4 would be 12.5. Then I added 1.5 inch as the side seam allowance. So on her waistline, I would mark a quarter of her waist circumference. 42 divided by 4 is 10.5. Then I would replace the 2.5 inches of that I took there. Then after that, I would also add 1.5 inch for the side seam allowance, and the next thing I did was to extend the waistline, and I went ahead to connect the points between the bust line down to the waistline. So using the curved part of my ruler, I placed it at that point below the bust point line and connected to the midpoint of her armhole line. So I went back in to blend that point so I don't have any sharp edges. Then from her bust line, I went upwards by 1.5 inches, and I went ahead to create her armhole curve like this. After creating the armhole curve, I would take a dart of 1 inch from here by coming downwards by 1 inch. Then place my ruler this way and make a connection from that point below the bust point line to that point at the armhole, and from here I would make an extension of 1 inch that I took for the dart there. This is so as to not be short of the armhole curve. Now I would create a new armhole curve to this point like this. So once the new armhole curve is formed, I would measure what I have at this point. So what I had was 0.25 inches. So I came here and marked it, and then I would connect that point back to the waistline. So the reason for this is so that I'm not short of measurement. So the next thing I'll be doing is to mark her bust darts right here. So the bust darts will be 1 inch because the difference between her front and back half length is 1 inch. So from the bust point line, I went inwards by 0.75 inch and I went ahead to create the bust darts. So after marking the darts, I made an extension for closing of the darts like so. And in order to close the darts, I would need to cut out the pattern from the rest of the pattern paper. Then I cut through this line here all the way to that point below her bust point line. Then I went ahead to close the bust darts, and to keep the bust darts in place, I would use my masking tape to hold the darts down. So after closing the bust darts, I would also close these darts at the armhole area. So to do that, all I did was to pinch the line on this part of the pattern paper like this. So you have to pinch exactly what you measured there. So I would place the previous armhole curve towards the new armhole curve so as to create a full armhole curve again. So to hold that place, I used my masking tape. Then the next thing I did was to use my marker and mark out the armhole curve that I'll be working with. Then I went ahead to cut out the rest of the pattern like this. So while cutting through this point, I made sure to add 1/2 inch to the shoulder slant measurement so that I'm not short of measurement. So now to create the princess tie line, I just cut through this shape like so, and we have the princess dart bustier ready. So the next thing is to move on to the back pattern. So for the back, I have already added the 1 inch zipper allowance. I've marked her waistline, and over here is her bust line. So like the front, her shoulder to her bust line for the back is 10.5, while her shoulder to the waistline for the back is 17 inches plus 1/2 inch for seam allowance. Remember that her front waistline was 18 inches. So I also marked a neck width of 3.5 inches for the back. So the measurement started after the zipper allowance. I also marked her shoulder point, her shoulder slant, and half of her armhole measurement. So the first thing I did was to mark 1/4 of her bust circumference on the bust line. So 50 divided by 4 is 12.5. Then 1.5 inches for the side seam allowance, making it a total of 14 inches. Then on the waistline, I went ahead to mark half of her bust band measurement. So that would be 4.5. Then on the bust line, I just marked the same point, then went downwards by 1 inch. So I extended the 2 points together in a straight line. Then on her waistline, I'll be taking a dart of 1.5 inches instead of the usual 1 inch. So 1.5 divided into 2 would be 0.75 inch on both sides of the line. So the next thing I did was to just extend the dart upwards to that 1 inch below the bust line. So I would also find the midpoint of her armhole line, then go inwards by 1/2 inch, Then from her bust line rather, I went upwards by 1.5 inches and went ahead to create the armhole curve like I always do. Placing the curved part of my ruler at this point below the bust line, I would make a connection from that point to the midpoint on her armhole curve to create the princess tie line. So I'm just going back in to make sure that there are no sharp edges around that point like this. Then I added 1/2 inch to her shoulder slant measurement. Then for the neck depth, I went downwards by 5.5 inches and created the shape for the neckline like so. Now on the waistline, I would mark a quarter of our waist circumference, which would be 10.5. 42 divided by 4 is 10.5. Then remember the dart of 1.5 inches. I would replace that right there. Then remember the side seam allowance of 1.5 inches. So I marked it right there. And the next thing I did was to just extend the line this way and create the side seam line. So after I'm done with that, the next thing is to just cut out the pattern like this. So here is my back panel 1 and this is my back panel 2, and that is basically all about it for the back pattern. So at this point, I just want to let you guys know that I have a paid class for this particular jumpsuit going for 1,000 naira. So you get instant access to the videos after payment is confirmed. So if you're interested, please make sure you contact me with the number you can find on the screen, either through WhatsApp or Telegram. So back to the main tutorial, I would be modifying the center front pattern by first marking 2 inches from the armhole area all the way to the shoulder slant. So after marking this, I would just extend the point downwards like so. Then from the center front around the neckline area, I would go inwards by 1.5 inches. So that would be 3 inches on a fold. Then I extended that point upwards to the neckline area. Now, remember that the neck depth was 3.5 inches. So I placed my tape measure right there, and from there I went downwards to about 8 inches. So this is how low the yoke would go because she's busty and she doesn't want her bust to be revealed. So I went ahead to just create a shallow sweetheart neckline shape like this. Then the measurement from this shoulder slant down to this line here was 5 inches. Then from the neckline down to the sweetheart neckline, what I had was 4.5 inches. So from this point here, I went downwards by 1.5 inches. Then I decided to increase this line here to about 6.5 inches. Then I went ahead to just recreate that sweetheart neckline shape again. Now from this point, I went downwards by 2.5 inches, then placed the ruler this way and connected down to that 1.5 inch below the neckline curve. And the next thing is to cut out the shape for the yoke. So here the yoke is ready. So I just use my marker to write out yoke there. And this is the pattern that I'll be working with for the center front. Here are the rest of the patterns that I'll be working with. And the next thing to do is to transfer the patterns to fabric. So I'll be working with this onion colored velvet and onion colored tulle net. And I'll be cutting out the major patterns for the front and back on the velvet fabric, while the yoke will be cut out on the tulle. If you know velvet, you will know that velvet stretches. So for ease of working with the velvet, I ironed interfacing. I think this one is paper stay, and you can see that the fabric no longer stretches. So I've gone ahead to add 1/2 inch seam allowance to all the necessary parts around my patterns, and then I added 1/2 inch around this area of the front where I cut out the yoke all the way to this point, except for this neckline area. Then for the yoke, I made sure to add 1 inch round the entire pattern instead of 1/2 inch. So I didn't add to this part. So I'm going to be sewing the yoke into this part of the front. So I have also gone ahead to cut out the lining pieces for each of the fabric, and I used satin fabric as the lining. So the next thing I did was to place a notch at this point where I have sharp points. So the reason for this notches is so that it will be easy for you when sewing. So I notch those 2 points like so, and then notch the center front. Then I notched the under bust area, then the bust point line and the bust line. So I have already notched the necessary points at this other piece of the front. So the next thing I would be doing is to begin the sewing process. So here I have the front pieces all laid out, and I'm going to be joining them by 1/2 inch seam allowance across this area. But before doing that, I would first be padding up the bustier. Guys, my background is white, so it will be hard to see what I am doing, but I made sure to explain. So this is the pad that I cut out for the center piece, and I placed it right there at the underbust line, and I also cut out the shape that I need for the other part of the front. Normally I would say you should iron it, but because this is velvet, I would rather be stitching the wadding, which is the pad. I will be stitching it onto my fabric like so, and also stitch here too, and also stitch here. Then I would go ahead and join them together by 1/2 inch seam allowance. So this is the back, and you can see that I ironed interfacing on all the pieces for the back. So I'll be joining them together by 1/2 inch at this point and also at this point, making sure to leave the zipper allowance side opened. So this is how the front looks like after joining. You can see the effect I have at the bust area thanks to the pad, and I also went ahead to join the lining piece for the front, and I have also joined the back together, and I also have the lining all joined together too. So now it's time to prepare the yoke. Remember that I added 1 inch round my yoke pattern, and I forgot to mention that I cut out 4 pieces of the yoke so that I can have a firmer grip. So right here I'm just going ahead to use my pin to hold the 4 layers of the yoke together. Then from this side of the yoke, I went ahead to sew the 4 layers of the yoke by 1/2 inch seam allowance. Remember that the allowance that I added around the yoke was 1 inch. So I'm using 1/2 inch first from the yoke because I'm not going to be turning the yoke with the lining. Instead, I would be top stitching it to the front part of the bustier. So this is where I stopped my stitching. I left the curved part of the neckline opened. So right now I'm just going back to trim off the excess allowances around the yoke. But while doing this, I made sure not to cut through the seam line or the stitches that I had made before. So if you're watching this video at this point and you're not yet subscribed to the channel, please make sure you hit the subscribe button. So once I was done with that, remember the opening at the neckline area. So I would insert my hand inside that part and pull or turn the yoke inside out like this. And also recall that the yoke has sharp points, so I used my scissors to carefully push those parts of the yoke outside. So I'm done flipping the yoke inside out. The next thing to do is to give the yoke a good press. So I'm done pressing the yoke and you can see it is laying nice and flat. So the next step now is to turn this area of the front by the 1/2 inch seam allowance that I added there. So what I did was to place the lining right on that area, pin them together. So I'm just going back to place a notch at the sharp point of the neckline. It is very important that you place these notches so that when you are sewing, it will be easier for you to navigate through. So after placing the notches, I will begin by sewing the neckline with my hemming gum. So I added 1/2 inch seam allowance right there. So I started by sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and as I sew, whenever I get to a sharp point, I put my needle down and then I would raise my machine foot, flip the fabric this way, make sure that the lining is well placed, and then I would begin to sew, making sure that my hemming gum is along the seam line. So at this point, I was approaching the first notch. So I placed my needle down at that point, raised my machine foot, then I proceeded to snip or to notch that point very close to the stitch that I made at that point. So this is why it is very important that you notch. So because I notch, I can easily flip my fabric this way, like this. Then before I flip, I would make sure that everything is aligned with the lining. Then I would proceed to sew. You can see the importance of notching. If you don't do this, it will be very difficult because it was not easy for me at all. So when I get to the second sharp point, I would make a notch just like I explained previously, and I would continue to sew the neckline by my 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I was close to the next sharp point. So like I explained, when I get to that point, I would place my needle down like this, then raise my machine foot, make a notch very close to the stitch line, and then I would flip my fabric the other way around and sew. So after sewing, I'm just going back to confirm that everything came out well. And the next thing I did was to trim off the excess allowances around that area. So you can choose to notch, but I find out that trimming out the excess allowance is a lot easier for me because when it's time to iron, there will be no need for all those extra allowances around that area. So I'm done trimming off the excess allowances. Now remember that the neckline has a sharp point, which is here. So I pushed it out like this and used my scissors to push out the rest of the fabric. Now I would also repeat the same thing on the other side. Use my scissors to push out the edge. So now I'll be taking this to my pressing iron and I would be giving the neckline a good press. So I'm done pressing the neckline and you can see how relaxed and how well laid out it is. There are no unnecessary foldings. Even on the inside, you can see how relaxed it is. So the next thing to do is to turn the back neckline with the lining. So you're going to place the lining over the neckline of the back like this and sew by 1/2 inch. So while sewing the neckline, I also used my hemming gum. I love my hemming gum so much. It makes the whole work easy for me when it comes to having a relaxed neckline. So after sewing, I'm just going ahead to trim off the excess allowance, and after trimming, I will take this to my pressing iron and give the neckline a good press so that it relaxes very well. So I would essentially repeat the same thing on the other neckline of the back. Place the lining over the back neckline and sew by a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And just like the first one, I will trim off the excess allowance and take this to my pressing iron and give the neckline a good press. Now it's time to insert the yoke back into its rightful place. So to do this, the first thing I did was to place the sweetheart part of the yoke right under the sweetheart part of the front bodice and pin together. Remember that the yoke still has an extra 1/2 inch allowance. So I just overlapped the front neckline like this over the allowance left on the yoke and use my pin to hold the points together. At this other side where we have the sharp points, I would also place the yoke under the front bodice like this, and I would use my pin to hold them together. And over here too, I'm going to place that sharp point of the yoke under the front like this and pin. So I'll go back in and make sure that all the sides of the yoke is well balanced underneath the front bodice. So I'm done with the first half, and I would repeat all I did on the second half. So like I said, I would slightly overlap the front neckline of the main fabric over the yoke, then place the sharp point of the yoke right under the sharp point of the main fabric and pin, and repeat all the process that I did on the other side. So the reason why I decided to go with this method is because when I tried to turn the yoke with the lining, it was a fail for me. I tried that process 3 good times and I messed up real bad. So since I couldn't turn the yoke with the lining, I had to do it this way. But if you're able to do yours the other way around by turning the yoke with the lining, then that's okay. So I'll be taking this to my sewing machine, and from this point I'll be making a top stitch over the neckline until I get back to this point. I thought about doing the top stitch off camera, but I decided to just show you guys how I did it. So I made sure that my stitching was tight, and following the shape of the neckline, I've stitched very close to the fabric itself, making sure that as I stitch that my yoke is well placed underneath the fabric, because you need to trap the yoke under, because if at any point in time you miss your stitching on the yoke, you're going to have an opening or gaping, and you really don't want that. So just watch as I did mine. I stitched very close to the neckline, making sure that my yoke was underneath that point. So the key to sewing this is making sure that you follow the shape of the neckline and stitching very close to the edge of your fabric. So here is what the yoke looks like after the top stitching. So I'm going to flip it to the inside so we can see how it is. You can see how it is slightly overlapped underneath the main fabric. So the next thing is for me to give the neckline a good press. So I'm done pressing it, and you can see how relaxed it is. So I want to reshape the neckline again because it appears that it was looking square. So I just held the shoulder and then the center of the yoke like this, and with my scissors I just went back in to create just a little curve. So after reshaping the neckline, to finish off the raw edges that we have there, I cut out this strip of my velvet fabric and make sure to iron interfacing so that the velvet does not stretch. So you can call this process piping off the neckline. So I placed the strip of fabric over the neckline like this, and I started sewing them together by a 1/2 inch seam allowance until I got to the other side. So after sewing, I realized that I made a mistake here. So I will go back in and loosen this and recorrect the mistake. So after losing it, I had to pin it too, so that I don't make that mistake again. And I went back again to sew them together by a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So after sewing, I went back in to trim off the excess allowance around the neckline area. After trimming the neckline, to complete the process, I would fold this strip of fabric twice like this. Then I would go ahead and stitch right on top of it, making sure that as I sew, I still fold the fabric twice until I get to the other side of the neckline. So after piping the neckline, to complete this tutorial, I would just be placing the shoulder of the back onto the shoulder of the front, and I would go ahead and sew them together by the 1/2 inch seam allowance that I added when I was drafting the pattern. So I'm done sewing the shoulders together, and at this point you can go ahead and attach maybe a skirt or a trouser to the lower part of the bodice. Remember that this tutorial is only about the bustier with the square yoke. So here is the final look. So at this point of making the video, the dress isn't complete. I just quickly had to record the entire process while making this. So if at the end of the day I eventually get a picture of the dress once it is complete, I will definitely put it in the thumbnail of this video. But for now, this is all I can share with you guys. Please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel.